Tri-Cities. It's 9 o'clock on Friday, so it's time for Coffee with Karl. I'm Karl Dye from Trideck, and we've got another great guest today. Josh Lockala from PNNL is a material scientist who works in fundamental battery research. Good morning, Joshua.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us this morning. I got to get a couple things out of the way first, and number one is to say thank you to our sponsor, Moon Security. You just saw a great video. I learned a new term, porch pirates. The Moon Security obviously has some good solutions for. Mike Miller is one of our Trideck board members and sponsors Coffee with Karl. We really appreciate it. He does a great job with this whole business, his security solutions from businesses, commercial to residential, and even the porch pirate doorbell there you just saw in the video is a really great service. Mike and his team are great, and longtime Tri-Citians, and really, bedrock of this community. So if you have any security needs, see Mike and his team at Moon Security, downtown Pasco. So thanks, Mike. Okay, Joshua, we have a tradition on Coffee with Karl where we talk about coffee and mugs or coffee stories or something, whatever you got. I dug this one out of the cabinet. So it's the Tri-Cities Washington. We share this kind of common theme of our logo, Trideck, Tri-City Development Council, which is us, the Regional Chamber of Commerce, and then Visit Tri-Cities. And it was done a couple of years ago. We share the same building too. It talks about the way that our organizations can work together to better Tri-Cities. Thought that was applicable today because, to have Joshua, to have you on from PNNL. PNNL is such a huge part of our economy. PNNL just released their economic impact study, which I believe $1.9 billion in economic impact for the whole state of Washington, because obviously the Sequim campus and the Richardson campus as well, but just a huge driver, a huge part of our economy here in the Tri-Cities. So I thought that was a good mug to kind of kick our discussion off this morning. But Joshua, what do you got for us? You got a mug or a mug story?
So I have my University of Arkansas Razorback mug. So I'm a born and bred Arkansan. I did my PhD studies at the University of Arkansas. So I carry that badge around everywhere I go. And there's dozens of us in the Tri-Cities, dozens of us Arkansans here. So but once you find one, there's always a couple others that show up. So but
now I heard a rumor about you, Josh, and it relates to what some might call it like a war cry for the Razorbacks. Other people might call it hog calling, but is that how you identify, one or other? If you kind of think like maybe you're a Razorback, do you give them a high sign or something? Do you do something? How does that work?
So the hog call is actually a very complex. So you don't just do the hog call every which way. Okay. Now, if you do see somebody from Arkansas, the first thing you're going to talk to them about is where they're from, and then who that could be who they know. And then you just start expanding, because I like to say that Arkansas is just one big small town. And so, you could be on one side of the state and somebody who you worked with somebody who worked with one of your relatives on the other side of the state. Yeah. And so it's just how it goes. And so there's we just met with a couple who are in the Tri-Cities, and she grew up in Arkansas, and we had a big conversation about different things, all the foods we miss and restaurants we go to and stuff. And but if you see somebody with a Razorback, you just give them a little woo pig. That's all you say. You just give them a little woo pig.
Just woo pigs. Yeah.
Just woo pig and call it a day. Like go Cougs. That's kind of the equivalent of you just give them a little woo pig and call it a day.
That's awesome. I like how it's kind of low key too, right? Like you don't make too big of a deal. You kind of low key it, just kind of hey, woo pig is I like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Now what part I've been to Arkansas myself. I used to travel through there and have friends who live down there. But what part of Arkansas are you from? Just out of curiosity.
So I'm from the west part of Arkansas. So I grew up in a small town called Mena. but we lived in Fort Smith for a while, or
Okay.
outside of Fort Smith, while I commuted up to Fayetteville. So
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of like timber country a bit, right? Like it's maybe a little bit more mountainous and stuff versus down like down in the Mississippi. There's like a lot of rice growing
right.
and
So
stuff down in that.
your state is actually kind of split in half.
Yeah.
And so from Little Rock east side is all the Mississippi Delta region. And so that's where you have your rice, your cotton, your soybean. And then on the west side is definitely your more timberland. And but you know, Arkansas is one of its prime exports is actually rice. And so people are pretty surprised that and bromine because we're right there along the base of Arkansas as a large producer of bromine, and they're actually expanding that into lithium extraction, which plays
Oh, really?
into our batteries. Yeah, so there's a couple of startup companies that are taking that brine, right? Because it's just brine.
Okay.
From beneath, there's a massive reservoir, northeast part of Texas, north part of Louisiana, and then the southern part of Arkansas. And they're taking that brine and extracting that and getting some of the largest lithium yields out of a brine in the United States.
Really? Wow. Number one, you're like the perfect guest because we just went from Arkansas to your topic of batteries. So that was awesome. Just like you just nailed it.
You know, they put me here for a reason. I mean, it's not unwarranted.
Yeah, you just set a high bar for Coffee with Karl. That was awesome. So so this reservoir, it's under Arkansas. Like it's I mean, is it all related to anything else like petroleum or anything, or like what's kind of like the history or source of that these pools of bromine that like, and then is lithium coexist with the bromine or like where
Right.
how does it
It's
exist in
like
these
so
pools?
it's a brine. It's a brine. So it's kind of
Okay.
like an underground well. So it's all water.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's different salts that are extracted from that. And what they do is they actually extract the salt and then just pump the water back in.
Okay.
So environmentally, it's fairly safe.
Yeah.
And so then they just do a dry extraction, and then what they're trying to do is they're trying to produce battery grade lithium carbonate, and so then that lithium
Okay.
carbonate can go wherever. So lithium carbonate is a product that you can actually use to make your cathode materials. So that's kind of your positive side of your battery. You need to have some kind of form of lithium to get in there to even start the process.
Okay. Oh, that's great. So we'll maybe backtrack a little bit, but first I have to say, Johnny Cash, huge fan of Johnny Cash, came from the Mississippi Delta, right? Like how high is the water, mama, 4 feet high and rising, all about the Mississippi flood now. Because I think his family maybe was cotton and rice farmers, something like that. But so let's go back to the topic we're here to talk about today. You work at the Innovation Center for Battery 500 Consortium, and from what I've gathered in learning about you, Joshua, is the battery research that you guys do is focused on transportation batteries, making them lighter, last longer, all these things. So you talked about anodes being the positive part of the battery, but can you start with just some basic, like, how do batteries work in general? And then let's get into more detailed conversation about the research that you guys do and how lithium, and go back to Arkansas and the bromine filtering and stuff.
Yeah. So batteries are really interesting. So lithium ion batteries. I like to use the example of shoes. So you can imagine on each side of a battery is basically two shelves, and each shelf has some cubes, and you put a shoe in. So that's your lithium ion is your shoe. And so you can imagine if you have to have shelves on both sides, it's pretty heavy, and it's a lot of space, right? But each shoe has its own spot, and generally you're not going to lose a shoe as it goes back and forth from each side. And the other example is your shoes are not lined up straight. One side is up high and the shoe slides down, and so you have to push the shoe up one side and then it slides down. And so that's your actually charge and discharge, right? So you're charging it up. So you're having to push the shoe up and get it into the container where it holds until you're ready to let the shoe fall back down. And when the shoe falls back down, you actually get the charge out of the battery. So that's your discharge. That's when you're actually using it. And so that's kind of lithium ions. It's actually a pretty elegant system. You know, you're just moving shoes the whole time, and each shoe has its own spot. So you don't lose any. It's pretty long and stable. But when we think about electric vehicles, you know, we're really concerned in what's called our energy density. And so and that would be gravimetric energy density. And that's just a big fancy word for saying how much energy can you get out of it for how much it weighs. So it's watt hours per kilogram rather than volumetric, which is how much energy can you get in the smallest form factor. And so you have a lot of space on a vehicle. And if you think about electric vehicles, basically their whole battery is the whole base of the vehicle. So your frame, and then on top of your frame, you just have batteries go through from one side to the other pretty much. And so they're concerned with how much does the battery weigh? And so that's kind of the BAT 500 consortium is saying, okay, lithium ion batteries, we have this system. It works great. But unfortunately, we only have a number about 150 to 250 watt hour per kilogram is like state of the art. Okay. So the 500 comes from the goal is, well, we need to actually double that and get to 500 watt hour per kilogram. And so you got to think that this energy is how much energy you can get at a certain of voltage. So that's really when you think about electric vehicle, you think, how far can I go before I need to charge this back up? And so that's kind of what the goal is also is we want to extend the reach and also decrease the weight so that when we're extending, getting that higher capacity, we're not weighing down the car and actually hurting us because then we have to take away weight on other spots.
Oh, totally. Is that so? Like as you talk about the 500 watt hours per kilogram, is that, you know, from Department of Energy, is that one of these earth shots that we hear about? Like I know, you know, $1 a kilogram for hydrogen, and off the top of my head, I can't think of the other ones, but is that one of the earth shots from DOE?
It's kind of one of those, right? So okay, the project is funded by the VTO office of the DOE. So that's the Vehicle Technology Office of the Department of Energy. And they've kind of set the guidelines of this is where we want your project to go. So we have certain guides. So for example, we want a 350 watt hour to cycle for 800 cycles. And then, or we want a 500 to cycle for 200 cycles. And so we actually have to change a lot of the chemistry of the battery to do that. Gotcha.
And I'm kind of starting off with some real basic science here, but like lithium,
go for it.
Ions as the material inside the battery, with your analogy to the shoe bins and stuff, like in our cars generally today, we have like lead acid batteries, right? As the electrolyte, I think is the term. So can you talk about that? Like lithium ion batteries, obviously we know in our phones and computers and stuff, and it's been there for a long time. That's the batteries that are in EVs because of the power density that you're talking about. But kind of the history, or what we still have in our internal combustion engine cars, are lead acid. Is that like, do the electrolytes work differently, or what's the big thing about like the lithium ion versus the old fashioned lead acid?
Well, so lead acid is very high instantaneous current. So if you look at your lead acid battery, It's a 12-volt battery. It's going to tell you it's 70 amp hours. And then it's going to tell you it's 350 or 400 cold cranking amps. So the whole premise of the lead acid battery is just to provide the spark and everything that the motor needs to get the motor to start. Yeah. And so to switch from that to another type of battery, we have to actually understand that when you're like your electric vehicle, everything is running off the battery. And so you have to think that was a 70 amp hour cell at 12 volts. And those are about 35 pounds. So that's about 15 kilograms. And so your watt hour per kilogram for a lithium ion battery or for a lead acid battery is very low, very low. And so it does not have what we would need for an electric vehicle, because every part of the electric vehicle is running off the battery. So we need a lot of them. We need them to be able to provide a lot of the same voltage with a high amount of current pulled from it, because everything's running. So, you've got, if it's a 4 motor, so each wheel has an independent motor that's running, and then you've got regenerative brakes that will, while you're braking, it'll turn that back into electricity and charge some of the battery. But everything else is run off the batteries. So there's mechanical pieces, and so we had to completely switch out what we needed, because we needed so many batteries, right? You couldn't put 12 lead acid batteries in a vehicle, because we have way more energy in a smaller form factor that weighs a lot less. And so that's where the switch came from. But it's not enough right now. Because you get 200 miles and then you have to charge for 30 minutes to an hour. And you don't really want to do that. You want to spend 5 minutes at a gas station and then just keep on going. So that's kind of the goal for the switch, is that, you realize that if you want an electric vehicle to take you farther, and if you want it to perform closer to an internal combustion system, then we have to even go further with our batteries for it to be competitive. Inside a town, it works great. You got stop and go and stuff, but unfortunately, there's work with the DOE with energy corridors to make charging stations more prevalent. But the big concern is how long it takes to charge, and then how far you can go before you're having to sit for an hour. And an hour on a 6-hour drive, every 2.5 hours plus is not it's not tenable. And so that's kind of what our goal is. And so
no, that's that makes sense. I mean, for market acceptance, if you will, right? Like, realizing there's incentives from the federal government and tax credits and things like that to try to incentivize purchasing the EV, but ultimately, because we're just used to a gas car, we want to have it perform the same way, right? As far as accessibility, how long do you stay in the filling station, all those things, and that totally makes sense. Let's talk about the batteries themselves. And I think you mentioned that you have some visual aids, and I think this might be where you're going, but I want to say that, like, a Tesla battery, and I've seen videos about them, that they use round cells that maybe are like a similar kind of a commercial cell that might come in your screw gun or your impact wrench or something, right? Like, you could take these cells and use them for tools, other applications, and then I think it was Tesla, like, they just kind of basically solder them together in these racks, and they have cooling and stuff. But I think, aren't you guys working on like pouches, like some different forms of how the battery container itself? Is that some of the research you guys do?
So form factor is a pretty important part, but it's more of what your needs are. And so from a form factor point of view, so I can start out like this. So
Yeah.
for example, the bat 500, we're a top down. We say we have a 500 watt hour per kilogram goal, but within the lab we have like a lot of skunk work type thing. But we can't use a lot of materials to test a lot of batteries, and so we actually use what the coin cells. So these like 60-32 form factors, and these are actually just a single layer of material on each side with a separator and electrolyte. And we can do that, lots of parallel testing to understand, okay, what's the material, how good is it, and do we actually need to elevate it to a more practical point. You can imagine if you have two materials in just a single form factor, if it passes those and we see good performance, we're going to upscale that. And you mentioned like Tesla, so this is kind of what you're talking about. So these are the kind of the standard lithium ion cells within a Tesla, and there's about 700 of these that are all just put together, and they're controlled by a system, and there's cooling and stuff. But these are all just rolled versions of a pouch cell.
Oh, okay.
So it's the same principle. You've got one side, the cathode, you've got another side, the anode, and it's separated, and then it's just rolled together. It's called a jelly roll.
Okay.
So we actually do form factors, and you were talking about the pouch cell. So if it gets past the fundamental stage, we actually put it in a stack. So you can actually see, like, this is multi-layer. So instead of just a single cathode, a single anode and a single cathode stacked together, we actually have 16 of each, 16 plus. Okay. And that's very similar to a Tesla battery. Because what we want to do is we want to say, and this would make sense, is like, okay, if it works on the small scale, how does it work on a practical scale? If you have a motor and your motor works and it's a 1 cylinder, a 2 cylinder, well, let's actually make it an 8 cylinder. Let's bring it up to scale and see how it runs. So that's the principle of what we're doing, is we're bringing it up to scale, because the problems that are hidden because it's so small in the coin cell are magnified, because instead of 1 to 1, it's now 16 to 16. So 32 plus layers. So you have a lot more repetition and a lot more energy coming in and out to determine whether or not it's actually a good material, or if it's just going to fail very quickly.
Right. So what's the advantage of stacking all of those, the pouches together and then rolling them up like the jelly roll thing versus, like you have, let's say, a tank or, whatever. If you're going to design a car, and I'm thinking of just like taking a gas car and converting it, right? So why wouldn't you just build something and it just has lithium ion in it with cathodes? Like, is there something about, like size limitation or something that makes it like, this is the size that works best, and then we're better off to, wire them in parallel or whatever you do to make it work? Is that, how does that affect it? Like,
that's part of it. And so, there's a real balancing act. There's a graph that shows how big you can make the battery, versus how much weight you're taking up, and how good the kinetics are, how good the battery can actually run at that size factor. And so it's actually a lot better to have a bunch of the smaller ones, because you can get more charge. Let's go back to lead acid batteries. Okay. Let's say you've got two different marine batteries. Okay. You've got one marine battery for your regular motor, and then you've got your other battery for your trolling motor. All right. So that's a deep cycle. They call it deep cycle. So one, you have a bunch of different batteries, very thin batteries, and the other you have maybe 3/4 of that amount, but they're a lot thicker. So if you have a lot of thin batteries, you can pull energy out of that really quickly, but you don't have a lot of capacity, right? Because they're not as thick. You can extract the energy very quickly, but you're not going to get that extraction for long term. Rather, where you have your deep cycle, they're a lot thicker. They're made to run at a lower current for a longer amount of time. So it's a very similar principle of, okay, we're going to design these batteries. We need to balance how thick they are for how much energy we need. And then we need to balance that with how quickly do we want to pull that energy in and out. And so that's kind of the engineering side of it, of the balancing act of how much energy do I want to store in here versus how fast do I want that energy out. And so if you shrink, either you shrink the battery or you shrink the cell, the width of the cells to be able to extract the energy quicker. And so the balancing act is that, okay, we can put a bunch of C-sized jelly rolls. They're thin enough that we can extract the energy quickly to run an electric vehicle, but thick enough to where we have the capacity.
So when you wire them together to that point, and they are, like they quickly let the energy out, which kind of meets that goal, then, is the controller kind of like taking this cell and then this cell and then this cell versus taking them all at the same time and evenly taking them down? Like, is that part of the EV technology too? So that you kind of get the balance. Is then they're operational or like a software thing?
Yes. Yeah. So there's it's a whole electrical engineering field almost dedicated to how these systems run, and you're balancing how smart the system is. So what they'll do is, I don't know the exact voltage parameters, but you can put your batteries in a series or in parallel. So they'll balance that, they'll get the voltage they need, and then they'll just put them in parallel so that they can just have extra capacity. And so that's kind of what they're doing, is they say, how many batteries do we need to get the proper voltage? And then we'll just clone that 1,000 times to get the proper thing. And so the battery system is going to take each one of those 12-volt systems and discharge and split everything so that we're using, we're kind of shaving off the top of everything. But the program is really interesting, and it has to figure out, there's a lot of standards. So do we actually, how far do you want your program to go? Because sometimes if you really wanted to be very advanced, you can say, okay, this battery had less capacity last time, this one cell out of 700. And so let's pull a little bit less charge from that. And then this battery over here has greater charge. And so let's balance. So there's also a balancing act. And then not only that, then we have to say, okay, what's the health of all these batteries? So there's a whole science on how do we determine how healthy these batteries are. And then where's the capacity limitation? Because depending on your standards, sometimes you'll say, okay, the battery has reached 70% capacity. It's unsafe to utilize an electric vehicle. So now we need to replace your batteries. And so that opens up a whole separate use of, can we actually recycle those batteries? They have 70% capacity left. They're not safe enough for the road, but are they safe enough for stationary storage? So it's the term second life. So there's a lot of second life kind of studies going on there too.
Yeah. And Joshua, this is awesome. And I learned a lot, but I feel like I'm taking you away from your science, like the area that you focus on, which I think is lithium, right? Like, I mean, what's your specialty, or what do you specifically do, in your job as far as the research that you do that has this effect on EVs? Like, is it about the lithium? Is it about the electrolyte? Or is it just the whole battery itself, the cathode and the anode, the way that they work together? Like, what's your specialty, or what do you specifically work on?
So I'm part of the pouch cell scaling team. The BAT 500, in order to reach 500 watt hours per kilogram, we actually have to switch the anode completely. So back to my shoe analogy, if we want to increase the capacity, the shelves we need to store those shoes just becomes ways too much. But if you imagine you take all those shoes and instead of putting them in shelves, you were able to just stick them onto the side and they would stay there, and you don't have to have anything to hold them there. And that means you can put a whole lot more shoes, because now you don't have the area of the shelving. You don't have the weight of the shelving. And so you've decreased two main factors. So I'm going to throw out some numbers to tell you, to give you a scaling factor. So like a graphite anode is about 150, 180 milliamp hours per gram. Okay. Lithium metal, if you just use lithium metal, 3,860 milliamp hours per gram. And that's the capacity. So you can already see, okay, there's a capacity difference. One is really big capacity and the other is very small. And then the other thing you have to remember is lithium is light, one of the lightest metals. And so you've got carbon, it's much heavier, relatively speaking, than lithium. And so you've got it's light, it's got a lot of energy, but it's got a lot of problems, which makes it the perfect form for a future battery to get us to the 500 watt hour per kilogram battery. But my upscaling entails a lot of different battery materials too. But BAT 500 focuses on how do we get lithium metal to work so that we can reach 500 watt hours, because this is one of the only methodologies we can get to a 500 watt hour per kilogram battery.
And that, like the graphite versus lithium analogy you just gave, is that relates to the anodes, or that relates to the electrolyzer itself?
It's the anodes, yes.
Okay. So you guys are working on using lithium as an anode and as the electrolyzer itself, both?
Right. So the electrolyte is going to be moving lithium from one side to the other. So it's basically blood. That's the kind of the nomenclature is lithium ions. The electrolyte within the lithium is just blood, and it's just moving lithium from one side to the other. So in the shoe analogy, it's the little river, it's the little chain that's pulling the lithium up, the shoe up to one side and then dropping it down to the other, but it has to slide on the chain or on the river to get to the bottom. So it's just a carrier system. And then so you have storage on one side, you have the lithium cathode on one side, so it actually contains lithium, and then you have lithium on the other side to act as a reservoir, but you're just moving lithium from one side to the other through the electrolyte.
And so what are some of the challenges in getting the lithium to be a good anode? Is it, I would assume that, like, that's kind of what you're saying, like that's what we're focused on to get to the 500. So what are some of the drawbacks of, or what the challenges in making lithium into the anode?
Yeah, so you can think, if you go from a structured system to an unstructured system, you're gonna have like grouping. So you can imagine if you're just throwing shoes at the floor, they're gonna start forming piles, and then so that's kind of what happens. And lithium's kind of worse in that, imagine if these piles were actually sharp enough to break the separator so that it's actually separating the charge, and it shorts the battery. So the battery, the charge, instead of going outside in a controlled manner, goes inside, and in an uncontrolled manner all at once. And so that's kind of a thermal runaway situation. So what we're really dealing with is we're dealing with, the shoes don't want to sit straight. They don't want to fit right. They're not Legos. They don't want to stack really well. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how to get them to stack really well so that they decrease the form, they're really dense, and then they do that repeatedly. Because lithium also has the problem of, sometimes the shoes will break off, and if they're not touching the wall, you can't get to them. And so we call it dead lithium. So you can imagine, okay, you just lost 5% of your capacity every cycle because that lithium is no longer, the shoes aren't touching the wall. And so you can't get to them to move them back to the other side. And so then they're just gone and your battery dies in 100 cycles.
And is that when you're talking like an EV battery drops below 70% and then it's not safe to use in a car anymore? I mean, that's what happens internally in the battery, is that not all the lithium's available to move back and forth when you charge it, discharge.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So you're actually losing that lithium carrier, that lithium. So it becomes a byproduct that kind of coats the surface. And so that, there's other things that get involved. You've got sludge, I keep going back to the shoe analogy. Now let's imagine that your shoes have dirt on them, so that every time they go up and down the river, that dirt comes off and forms a sludge, and then that shoe has to go through sludge. And so if it has to go through sludge, it meets a resistance, and so it has to try harder and harder to get the lithium through the sludge on one side or the other. And so that's part of battery degradation, is that if you're trying to push it through sludge, it's going to drop your voltage. And when you drop your voltage, then you reach a cutoff because it's unsafe to cycle at a voltage below. Maybe you would be able to get to that, but now you're in an unsafe voltage region because other chemistries can happen at that voltage region. Okay. And so, so there, the system becomes more complex, but the problems are very simple. They're simple problems to envision, but they're hard to figure out how to mitigate them. Yeah.
So to mitigate them, I mean, some of the stuff that you guys work on is a different chemistry. Is it different? Taking lithium, combining it with different chemicals or processes or something like that, or mechanical things, the shape of the pouch, or I mean, like what kind of things do you try, or what? How does it go?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things we can do. We can change the electrolyte, so we can add some additives. So let's imagine what we do is we're going to put an additive in that creates a chain link fence on the lithium side so that the sludge doesn't form. Or we actually make a specific type of sludge that won't propagate anymore, and it actually helps lithium go through in a simplified manner. So that's where we're modifying the lithium through the electrolyte. And then we can modify the lithium by, we have the lithium, we're going to go ahead and coat a protective barrier on top of the lithium, so that it only interacts whenever it's in the electrolyte, when it's the shoe form and it's going up. And so then it goes through that protective barrier, and we don't have to actually worry as much about that. But we still, the problems with some of those solutions is that we still sometimes get aggregates where, the shoe just doesn't want to go where it sits. It wants to actually go find its buddy and pair with its buddy. And so then you still get some of these aggregates, and that can break some of those protective barriers. And so what we've also been looking at is we've been looking at some mechanical things as well. What happens if we actually push the cell together? You got to think, lithium's a metal. Could we just actually push the lithium and see if we can force the shoes in a more compact manner? So there's multiple steps on how we're kind of addressing the issue. But the at this time, it's the lithium metal is the issue. It's the anode side.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of I believe that they work with PNNL, but like there's a couple companies I think that are located in Moses Lake. One's I think Group 14, and maybe the other one's like Stila. And I know that they're doing some type of an anode, and it's kind of focused on EVs, and I think making the batteries last longer and more effective and stuff. Is that like, I don't even know what their technology is, but is that some of the research that you guys do? And I mean, maybe it's proprietary, you can't talk about it, but is that part of the solution too? Is it seems like they're doing maybe like a silicon graphite anode or something. Like, does that
Right.
help like this
Yeah.
lithium flow that's a challenge?
Right. So kind of their approach is, well, so silicon, so you've got graphite. Okay. What you could do is that you can actually switch the graphite with silicone directly. And silicone
Okay.
has a large capacity, not as large as lithium,
Okay.
but the silicone will actually alloy with the lithium. And so instead of forming a
Oh,
plate, it's actually it's shoes and sandals. So now we've got sandals that like to bind with the shoes. But
okay.
but now those sandals will kind of break off because you're binding a shoe with a sandal, and those sandals are agglomerated. But whenever you pull those shoes off of the pile of sandals, sometimes those sandals will break off. So that's what the problem is with directly using silicone. So a couple of these systems there say, well, what if we combine? What if we have smaller particles of silicone and we combine it with graphite? So we're going to increase the net energy density of the silicone of the anode together, but we're going to kind of mitigate the problems with silicone. So it's like an intermediate. It's like silicone doesn't work very well. Graphite is graphite. It works really well, but it's got low energy. So can we add
Okay.
silicone to enhance the energy and still be able to cycle as well as graphite would? And
Okay.
so that's kind of we're at the very advanced stage of we want to get rid of all of those materials altogether and just have lithium on there.
I gotcha.
Because still that's lithium binding with something
Yeah.
else. We just want the lithium to go there and stay and then come back.
Okay. So let's go back to lithium and even the bromine pools back in Arkansas. But like, what's lithium in its natural form? Is it always in a solution? In water, or is it actually kind of show up as like some type of metal if you dug in the right place? Like, what does lithium look like in the nature?
Yeah, so a lot of times lithium is in a salt kind of form. So it's that's why they can get it extracted by water. So you've got all these brine pools. So in Arizona, all these lithium manufacturers and stuff, they're getting this lithium from a salt form. So they just add water and then it extracts the lithium and then they dry it out and then they get this lithium carbonate, different salt versions of the lithium, and then they will then take that and convert that into the more elemental form. So we actually have to have very high purity lithium when we use it in a battery. We're talking 99.99% pure lithium in its metallic form.
Yeah.
And so that comes with its own standards. I don't know if you remember your old science class, but if somebody put lithium in water, it actually reacts very violently.
Yeah.
And so, and then you just keep going down that list: lithium, sodium, potassium, and the reaction with water is more and more violent, and it'll even explode.
Wow.
And so if you want to see some fun videos, just YouTube some potassium and water experiment, and you'll just see somebody throw elemental potassium in the water, and it'll just be a massive explosion.
Yeah. Which and I'm thinking of, and I these talks are great because I always learn something. Last week we were talking about nuclear fuel, and I know, out in the Hanford site, we used to have this thing called fast flux test reactor that was sodium cooled, and sodium with water is the same thing, right? It's also a liquid metal kind of thing. Is sodium, bromine, lithium, these other ones you're talking about, are they all kind of related as far as their characteristics, somewhat on the elemental table?
Yes, yeah, right. So that's very much true, especially sodium. So if you think about your periodic table, you got your noble gases on one side. Helium, neon, all the way down, and then on the left side you've got hydrogen, and you've got lithium, sodium, potassium. So they react very violently because they want to lose an electron to stabilize, because they only have one extra electron. So now the electrons like to be paired, and so they've got this electron that's hanging out at the end, and so wherever it can find it, that's what it wants. So you have lithium metal in its pure form. You take it out and set it in air, it starts turning black immediately because it's reacting with water in the air, it's reacting with oxygen in the air, it'll react with the nitrogen. It just wants to react and get rid of that extra electron to be more stable.
Yeah. That's awesome. If you would have been my chemistry teacher in college, I might have ended up as an engineer instead of having a communications major. That's great. So, like, what's the history of lithium in batteries? Like, how do we figure out, like, hey, if you take some lithium and you filter it and you make it into pure lithium, that it's a really good battery electrolyzer? Like, what? Just out of curiosity, what? How did somebody discover that?
Yeah, I don't know the full history, but lithium metal batteries came first, and then in the 80s, South Korea and Japan, Sony really started working on lithium ion batteries. And then you've got John Goodenough in Texas, Sam Whittingham, who both won the Nobel Prize, and in lithium ion batteries, figured out how to get lithium ion batteries to work, along with a Japanese professor. And it really had to do with protecting the graphite anode. And so in order to get lithium ion batteries to work, I don't know if you remember, graphite is just a bunch of carbon stacked, right? It's like a deck of cards. Well, when the lithium would come in, if there was no protection, lithium was actually, whenever it's in solution, it's kind of like water, where it just kind of, water kind of connects together a little bit, matches charges. You got hydrogen connected loosely with the oxygen of the other water particles. Well, lithium's the same way. It's a positive ion, and it's kind of grouped with a bunch of negative ions, and so it's kind of a conglomerated. They're not together, but they're kind of dating. They're not married, but they're dating. They're kind of going along. Well, what happens is when when the lithium goes to the graphite, the graphite needs to only have the lithium. So they need to break up, and so that lithium can go in. But there was no protective layer, and so the whole couple would go in, and then the sheets, instead of being like this, would be broken apart, and so they would expand, and then your battery would fail because there'd be nowhere for the lithium to go. And so what they found is you have to have a certain electrolyte to break down to form a protective barrier to break up the couple in order for you to go to the men's only club of the lithium. And back to the couple, they're dating, but it's a no girls allowed, or it's a no boys allowed club right here.
Right.
And so, if a whole couple goes in, then it ruins the whole thing, and now your battery's dead. So
this is great. I mean, not only are you, just a great chemistry teacher, you also have these great analogies from the shoes to the couples and the marriage, and this is great. If like a secondary career as a teacher, professor, I'm just saying, maybe you should think about it, Josh. I appreciate your explanations.
Oh yeah.
So, how's it going? And again, maybe it's proprietary, you can't talk about it, but towards this goal, or this kind of earthshot goal of the 500 watt hours per kilogram. I think you talked about 350 or something before. Is that kind of generally where you guys are at as far as the level of technology you're able to do in the lab there?
Right. So, we have multiple reports that are public from DOE on kind of the status of BAT 500. So there's kind of two separate goals. So above 350 watt hour is actually what's called export controlled. So that means that we can't actually PNNL, but the DOE cannot release any of this information about the specifics of everything above a 350. So there's two separate levels. So we have 350 where we can publish on 350 and we say, okay, here's 350. We want to get 350 as long as possible. And then there's the 500, which is, okay, we can say, okay, we're at, we have a 400 watt hour battery that's cycled for 100 cycles, or however we want to release that statement, but we can't tell any of the explanation on what it is or that type of thing. But we are progressing towards 500. We've built a couple of those batteries. We've built 450, 400, 350. We built the gambit, and so now it's figuring out how do we stabilize these things. And I'll let you know that the difficulty is, so when we talk about the lithium, the watt hour per kilogram, so it includes the packaging, it includes the aluminum, it includes these tabs, it includes everything that isn't even active. And so you can imagine if we're, so that's where form factor will come in again. Okay, so you can imagine a nice, really thick cell that's going to have a lot of weight that's worthless, but we have to count it because you're putting the whole battery in. It's part of the whole battery. And so as we get to these higher and higher levels, we really see engineering problems of where can we shave weight? Because if we've got to shave weight somewhere, and at some point our packaging just can't get any thinner, or our separator just can't get any thinner, or we can't switch our tabs, and so then we have to start shaving active material or electrolyte. And so when we start shaving these things, it'll affect our performance. So that's kind of the real challenge of above 350 plus, is that now we're shaving important things. How thin can we go before it breaks the battery? So it's a real exponential curve of like, oh, we're so close, but then every small thing right here, you just have to do so much to get to the next level because the margins are so thin.
I mean, like from a research point of view, as you described that arc going up, as like once it starts to flatten out, now you're into engineering and you're doing the things you're describing, the shaving and everything else, these mechanical solutions. Like, how do you then break through or get the arc to go back up? Is it looking at different chemistry, different materials, different electrolytes, or is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you can imagine this whole system has this arc, but if we can change it to where the arc moves up a little bit past our threshold. And so, just 10 to 20, just a 10 to 20 milliamp hour per gram increase in capacity will make a huge difference because our margins are now that thin. And so now it's what's the most stable that can just get us to edge ever closer over that point, because we're either moving the curve in or we're moving the curve up so that it breaks past our point.
And so with the Battery 500 consortium, that's not just PNNL, right? Like that's other labs,
right?
Like DOE labs. Who else do you guys work with on the consortium? Out of curiosity.
There's I think the release has the right amount. I think it's 5 national labs. Like 12 universities, and then we actually have a business board, the ABC Battery, American Battery Board, that has GM, but it has GM, Tesla, Ford, all these companies that are helping to business advisory board to help us say, okay, hey, these engineering things are really great, but we can't even do that in a real car. So here's kind of a guide of like, here's where we're going for electric vehicles. Can you meet us here? rather than stay over here, because this is great, it works, but there's a disconnect again. And so we need to get you there. So that's really kind of the fundamental aspect. And PNNL serves as the central hub in which all these different groups are doing different things, different cathode, different anode, different electrolyte, protection layer. Like they're doing all the fundamental stuff, and they say, okay, we found something really good that could get us that 10 extra milliamp hours, or could get us an extra 100 cycles. Can you try it? It's past these check marks. It's gained up the ladder. So now PNNL says, okay, we'll put it in our test form. We'll put it in a real battery, and then we'll test it and see if that will get us there. So that's kind of PNNL's point. PNNL's point is saying, okay, you're doing all the baseline research. Now we're funneling that in to expedite it, so that PNNL is not doing all the work on the electrolyte and the anode and the cathode and doing the engineering up here. So kind of, teamwork makes the dream work, everybody's shooting at the same goal, but we're going to integrate that into our system. And then we're going to test out all those different things at the practical scale once they've reached this really performance benchmark. And we're going to say, okay, this works. Now you've helped us progress. Now this is our baseline. So every time something new comes out, it's the new baseline until something else can beat it.
Okay. So like with your industry advisory from the major US manufacturers, did they have a connection to the intellectual property that comes out of the research, or do they have a commercialization agreement like with DOE through the consortium, or is it just like, okay, it's open market? Once that you get to this point, now they're going to have to license technology from the consortium, or like just in general, how is that plan to work as it moves forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's really interesting because everything that PNNL employees develop is owned by Battelle and then gets licensed for them. And so I think within the contract system, that's going to be the same way through all these different consortium partners and stuff. But some of it is released in publications, and so it's open use. Once it's released, they can there's a lot of patenting. Each individual will patent something, and so they won't publish until the patent's gone through, and then so then companies just take the patent and say, give them their fair share, and then they just keep using it.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, but with the consortium, you guys don't ever like take the batteries and, like you say, PNNL works as a hub, brings all the technology together, and then does the testing. But these are all in lab conditions. You don't like make up a whole battery cell for a vehicle and then test it under real world conditions, right? That's totally separate. This is kind of the lab. Yeah.
So this is really kind of it's where the national labs shine. So the national labs kind of serve as the function of, you've got fundamental research right here, you've got commercialization up here. If they can't make a profit of it in the next 5 years, they're not going to even implement it, right? And who cares about profit whenever we're doing something really cool with science here? So PNNL and the national labs serve as that middle ground of bridging the gap. What have you done really good? How can we show that it's potentially commercially viable? And so even like DOE has all of their proposals. I don't know if you're familiar with the proposal system, but all of the proposals have how would you get it to market? Who's your business partners? Of how you could get, if this goes to market. So any of their lab calls or any of this, you should have a plan of who's your business partners, or, we've got a couple of partners who, if we license it, they'll go ahead and start utilizing it, that type of thing. And so each proposal will have a plan for how would you reach it to market if it's successful. So there is even that kind of built in, but it's not as especially depending on the proposal, it's not as clear. Like, you're not supposed to have your business partner who's ready to commercialize the moment you're done. It can be a little bit more like, as long as you know, kind of, you're funneling it towards this way, you've got some potential people who would buy the license off of you, if it works.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Like, Joshua, it's 10 o'clock. I mean, I could probably talk to you or ask questions for a couple more hours. This has been great.
For sure.
I really, really appreciate your time and coming on and the discussion, and just talking about what you guys do, which is amazing. I mean, we talked about the economic impact of the lab, but this is a great example of things that our state's focused on. The federal government, DOE's focused on. The decarbonization, transportation, such a huge part of that. Just to know the work that you guys are doing right here in Richland is really cool, and great information to share. But as we sign off, do you have any last words, or you want to give us it's Sue Pigs, right?
So it's Woo Pig. Woo Pig.
Woo Pig. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think it's Sue. Woo. Woo
well,
Pigs.
No.
Okay.
So I mean, it ends Woo Pig Suey, right? Because it comes from the old calling the hog Suey. But you don't actually say that. But you can imagine your grandmother calling the pigs up, and so but that's where. So it's just, you give them little Woo Pig, call it a day.
That's awesome. Joshua, thanks for your time today. I learned a lot, and this is a really interesting discussion, and we appreciate you coming on and sharing that with us today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It was really great. Really great chit-chatting.
Yeah, it was. So, Woo Pigs, and have a good weekend.
All right. Thanks. You too.
Okay. Bye.
All right.